Hello, all you beautiful nerd weirdos, and welcome back to Lore of the Worlds. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the weird, unique fantasy creatures that can be found throughout Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere books. And boy, do I have some weird, wacky creatures to talk to you about today. I got dragons, I have four-armed weirdos, I have flesh blob monstrosities, I have crabs. Not like that. Before we go ahead and get started, I do want to quickly warn you, there are going to be plenty of lore spoilers throughout this video, but there's nothing that I feel is going to take away from an average reader's first experience with Cosmere in these first few non-spoiler sections. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in and explore. Alright, we're going to go ahead and start the day off by looking at some of these fantasy creatures that are, let's face it, a little bit dumb. All of these creatures in this section are all going to be on a spectrum of intelligence that ranges somewhere between a tiny insect and my relatively intellectual cat. We're going to start off today's examination on Scadrial, where strange, amorphous blobs of flesh roam around through the ashes. And no, I'm not just being melodramatic there. Look at this nonsense. So these bad AI art looking monstrosities of flesh and bone are named mist wraiths, and they're far more interesting than they might first appear. So essentially mist wraiths are blobs of flesh that come out at night into the mists, scaring the living hell out of anyone that sets eyes upon them, and as far as we know, they're not harmful to living humans, but they do like munching on dead things. In fact, those bones that you can see through their translucent flesh are the leftover bits of dead animals and humans that they've consumed and added to their gross, fleshy collection. Oh, that feels weird to say out loud. So mist wraiths have a lifespan of approximately 50 years. They're able to reproduce through some means, but those details are probably best left from our minds. Speaking of best left from our minds, let's briefly discuss the Kolas. We're going to talk about them a little bit more in the heavy spoiler section later in the video, but for now, if you're avoiding spoilers, think of them as big blue giants that are very mean. I personally think that a good way to easily conceptualize Kolas is as Sanderson playing around with the fantasy trope of trolls, and that's where we'll leave it for now. Let's move on from the misty Scadrial and over to the sandier Taldane. For the purposes of this section, when I talk about Taldane, I am referring exclusively to the day side of the planet. We don't really know much at all about the life on the planet's dark side. If that day side, dark side distinction is confusing to you at all, you might want to go ahead and head over to the Every Planet in the Cosmere video I made. I have a pretty decent explanation there, if I say so myself. While Taldane might seem entirely devoid of fauna at first, it actually harbors a substantial amount of life if you look a bit closer, or in this case, a bit deeper. Pretty much every creature on Taldane lives underneath the sand, staying away from the harsh sun. But while the sun is harsh, it also provides life to those creatures underneath its auspices. The titular white sand of Taldane's dayside is actually just normal sand that harbors a very specific microflora, and that microflora is quite special. It uses the dayside's heavily invested sun as a source of fuel for sustenance for that microflora. When that flora on the sand has absorbed enough investiture, it turns this stark white, and in turn can be consumed by sandlings when they come close enough to the surface. Then, they consume the white sand, process the microflora, excrete out raw sand, whereupon the process begins once again. Before we move on to the individual sandlings, there's a few other things to note here. First off, every species of sandling that we've met so far is extremely hydrophobic, and parts of their carapace will literally start to melt away when exposed to water. Also, sandlings in general were probably inspired to some degree by Frank Herbert's Dune and the sandworms therein, which, doesn't really have a whole lot to do with this video, but Dune's awesome. Let's take a quick peek at those individual sandy boys up close. The most important sandling creature we've seen on Taldain so far is the Tonk, a beast of burden used to transport people and goods around in the sand. They look like a cross between a mule and a kangaroo, but covered in this gray carapace. Terha, a rhinoceros-looking variety of sandling, are used for a similar purpose as the Tonk, but are more specialized for hunting. It's unknown if the two species share a common ancestor, but it does seem likely. And while those two species of sandling are both domesticated, there are also numerous undomesticated sandlings throughout Taldain. A few of these to keep in mind are the Keldar and their cousins the Akeldar, wolf-like sandlings that presumably share some sort of common ancestor. There's also incredibly large varieties, such as the claw-legged Markin and the dragon-like Karok, as well as varieties that function as sorts of living traps, such as the Delrock. And that's about it. That's about all we know about Taldain's fauna, at least for now. The next planet we'll be visiting has an insane level of its ecology described for a fantasy book, and pretty much all of it is crab. But I'm not talking about any old crab here. No. These are magic crabs. I am, of course, referring to life on Roshar, the main planet of the Stormlight Archive series. And yeah, I know, not everything on Roshar looks like a crab. Some of it looks like lobsters. In all seriousness, life on Roshar is dominated by life that bears resemblance to sea life, and indeed sea creatures were a big inspiration for life on this planet. I mean, there is a gigantic magical storm that blows across the land after all, and indeed, that storm, called the High Storm, is vital to providing life to creatures on Roshar. Along with rain and wind, the storm deposits a sediment called crem onto the earth, which plants and animals consume for nutrients and can be processed into structural elements, carapace, outer shells, that kind of thing. You could very easily make the argument that crem is the powerhouse of the shell. Those aforementioned high storms are the reason why it's so important to build up a crab-like shell or various elements of chitin on a creature's body. High storms provide nutrients and water to life on Roshar, but they are absolutely intense. Without outer shells or forms of protection, animals and plants would be absolutely helpless to the multitudes of flying rocks, sticks, and even other animals caught up in the high storm's winds. Let's go ahead and zoom in and take a look at some of these individual species living throughout Roshar. Starting off small, we have a group of species known as cremlings. These little critters are small, lobster-looking things that live around and often feed off of, crem. There are probably a ton of different individual species of cremling living throughout Roshar, but we really don't know too much about those individual species, mostly because they're just not that important to the overall plot. A good reference point to our world would be the ecological niches of anything from large insects to small mammals. Cremlings come in all sorts of sizes and varieties, but for the most part, they're seen as kind of annoying pests. But obviously, not all creatures on Roshar are seen as pests. Indeed, some of them are actually quite helpful. One such domesticated variety of animal is named the Chol. They serve a similar function to horses on Roshar, being used for everything from farming to transportation, and in a pinch, can, I suppose, be used as food. But like horses during the Middle Ages, they are extremely valuable as work animals and are far more often used for labor than food. So hello! Another fun variety of domesticated crustacean is the axehound. Much like normal hounds, they are used for hunting, but they're mainly kept as pets. These delightful creatures are basically dogs, but for Roshar. They are very, very cute, and I want one. One thing I don't want is a white spine. I already have one. On Roshar, white spines are a variety of crustacean-like beings that are more or less comparable to panthers or wolves. They're very dangerous apex predators that live in packs and utilize their surprisingly large intellect to hunt with deadly efficiency. Just a few of their armaments include razor-sharp claws, massive tusks that can break off inside of their prey, Yikes, and as you may have guessed, a pointy white spine. Now, these dinosaur-looking murder beasts have even been known to hunt humans on occasion, so you really don't want one anywhere near your village. And indeed, white spines are described as nastier than even chasm fiends, presumably because chasm fiends don't, hunt humans for sport. If you direct your attention upwards on Roshar, you are likely to see a few sky eels flying around. Those are exactly what they sound like. They're eel-looking critters that sort of swim through the air. Luxspren can often be found floating around them for whatever reason. Who knows? Maybe we'll explore that further in the spoiler section. For the meantime, let's go ahead and move on to chasm fiends. But to do so, we're going to have to very quickly talk more generally about the idea of great shells first. These varied, gigantic crustaceans can be found across Roshar, ranging from the Reshi Isles to the sands of Emea to the chasms of the Shattered Plains. The most prominently featured great shells in this series are the chasm fiends, which, make the chasms beneath the Shattered Plains their home until they crawl up onto the Shattered Plains to pupate. Pupate into what? I don't know. Who knows? Genuinely, we don't know. The important takeaway here is that they crawl up into plain sight to pupate, which is very, very enticing to the humans currently inhabiting the outskirts of said Shattered Plains. You see, all great shells have massive gems at the core of their bodies, known as gem hearts. In fact, pretty much every native creature on Roshar has one, being derived in some way from the nutrients that Krem provides. But great shells have gem hearts that are much, much bigger than average creatures on Roshar, and therefore the gems that can be found within are much, much more valuable. Since humans have used these gems as forms of currency since time immemorial, some species of great shell have been hunted to endangerment or indeed extinction, as is the case with the Lancerin of Emea. There are plenty of great shells that have massive gem hearts as well as chasm fiends, but most of them have good ways of defending themselves and don't really make it a habit of sitting on top of the Shattered Plains pupating, like idiots. Okay, who would you rather fight for a big gem? This rock-looking thing or one crabby boy? I know what I'd pick. Now, interestingly enough, crustaceans aren't the only animals on Roshar to have gem hearts. Our next species seems to have developed them over millennia, despite not even being native to Roshar. The Rhyshadium are very large, very smart horses that have several unique properties to them. First off, they appear to attract spren, which really doesn't seem to happen with any other non-native species. They also select their own riders, and it's seen as an enormous honor if a Rhyshadium selects you as worthy to mount it. Now, how they actually make their selection is unknown, but it is known that they are near sentient and are fantastic mounts to ride into battle or just across the landscape. Okay, since we're bordering on sentience, I think that now is a great time to move away from the non-sentient life forms to explore a few of the more sentient ones roaming around throughout the Cosmere. But before we talk any more about physical beings, we're going to have a very brief discussion regarding... Let's really quickly define what I actually mean by living investiture in this context. So as you may have noticed, I haven't actually mentioned any of the garden variety magic life, such as spren roaming around throughout the Cosmere, nor other weird variations on life such as Nightblood or the Aethers. And that's exactly what I'm going to be referring to these beings as, because that's more or less what they are. They're living magic. And since Investiture tends to develop a mind of its own when left alone for too long, there are a lot of interesting varieties of living magic to talk about. In fact, there's so many of them that I decided to split them off all from this video and make an entirely separate one talking exclusively about living magical beings throughout the Cosmere. There's the aforementioned spren, there's Seons, but I'm also lumping other sorts of living magic into this category as well, such as Nightblood, Lifeless, Returned, Nightmares. Yeah, there's living nightmares in the Cosmere. Living nightmares! That one's gonna be a fun video, I promise. But for now, let's go ahead and jump back in and talk about the fantasy beings out there that are no cap going big brain mode. Why did I write that line? What we're going to be talking about next is... And so finally, we arrive at the big brain creatures of the Cosmere. Unlike the previous category, life here is approaching or even surpassing human levels of sentience, with the spectrum of intelligence landing somewhere between, like, my cat and the Earth baby from the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Let's start off back on Roshar and take a look at the two intelligent life forms that we at least think originated here. First off, we have our boys in blue. And no, unfortunately, I'm not talking about the Na'vi. What we're looking at here are called Saya-Ameans, a mysterious race of white-blue humanoid figures that presumably are from Amea, but again, we're just not really sure at this point. Honestly, we really don't know much about them at all, and most of what we do know comes from a single interlude that was from way back in Way of Kings. One thing that makes them unique is their ability to change their appearance at will, though, again, we have no real reference point as to how dramatic these changes can be or what the cost is. In the aforementioned interlude, we see a Saya-Amean named Axes that has the ability to, like, write tattoos on his skin and make notes for his future self. But in that same interlude, he's, like, also able to briefly suppress his sense of smell. So we have no idea how far this all goes, how far this rabbit hole goes. Really, and beyond that, your guess is as good as mine as to what these guys are capable of accomplishing. Far more prevalent on Roshar are the Singers, colloquially known as the Parshendi. They're a race of humanoids covered in marbled red, white, and black skin, as well as various levels of chitin. They are intimately connected to the land and the spren that inhabit it, singing the tones of Roshar to do things. Honestly, it's pretty hard to talk about the Parshendi without getting into full spoilers, so I'll definitely mention them in the spoiler section as well. In the meantime, a good way to conceptualize the Parshendi is as Sanderson's, like, race of elves, almost. Now, it seems a bit out there at first, but, like, think about it. They're attuned to the land, they're aloof as all hell, and since Roshar is so heavily invested, they're also inherently magical in a way that's, again, it's really hard to get into without talking about spoilers. So, red, white, and black-skinned marbled crab things. That's how we're gonna look at the Parshendi, at least for now. And the last fantasy race that we have to look at on Roshar is nowhere near native to the planet at all, arriving at some point from the very distant past. These are the Dacian-Ameans, better known throughout the Cosmere as the Sleepless. And while you might want to immediately jump to thinking that they're unique because they just don't sleep, the reality is so much weirder and more fun than that. Each individual Sleepless is actually a hive mind, consisting of a swarm of thousands of smaller, bug-like creatures, all in constant communication and perfect coordination with one another. Each individual insect making up the swarm has been specifically bred to perform specific tasks, such as acting as eyes, the mouth, or like finger-shaped insect individual bugs. There's a sort of continuum of consciousness going on there, with no one individual insect controlling the entire swarm. Indeed, they act in conjunction, and they're like replaced and rebred as they die. It's very like Theseus's ship, but for people. They can even send out like exploratory units from their main body to gather information and perform other small tasks separately from the bulk of their consciousness. And yeah, they do have one big collective consciousness, but this consciousness has the big limitation of both distance and connection. So if too many of the swarm are separated without contact for too long, they start to form a completely separate body, mind, and, of course, consciousness. This is how new Sleepless are born, or at least come to be. Over time, these swarms are able to actually adapt to their environment, deliberately breeding themselves to excel at certain tasks or look a certain way. For instance, the sleepless on Roshar look far closer to Kremlings than those on other planets, and that's a direct result of thousands of years of perfecting their breeding process to look closer to the native fauna and thus avoid discovery. If, say, like a scout unit is seen, people just take it as a individual small Kremling instead of some weird alien bug swarm thing. That tends to be a little bit more alarming to people. The Sleepless are absolutely fascinating, and I cannot wait to learn a little bit more about their race, which Sanderson has stated multiple times will have a big part to play in the future of the Cosmere. Speaking of big parts of the Cosmere, let's talk about the biggest fantasy creature here, not just in size, but possibly even importance. I am, of course, talking about everyone's favorite fantasy creature, the dragon. Heavily hinted at for years, this species only made its first in-book appearance very recently. And dragons in the Cosmere are pretty close to the traditional dragon design, featuring 4 legs, 2 massive wings, and very generally reptilian features. Unique to the Cosmere's dragons, however, is the addition of dragon steel, which is a sort of metallic material running up and down their bodies, culminating in their solid dragon steel horns. The actual magical properties of this dragon steel metal are unknown, but it does seem to be tied in some way to their inherent magic that dragons possess. Indeed, dragons in the Cosmere are able to kind of shapeshift into resembling whatever species or form they should desire, though the limitations and caveats of this ability, they haven't really been explained at all quite yet. And while we haven't seen too much in the way of dragons so far, they are set to heavily feature in the upcoming, aptly titled series called Dragonsteel. It's going to take place way back in the Cosmere timeline on a planet called Yolin, where dragons are one of 3 sentient species alongside humans and our next fantasy species, the Shodel. So these guys are weird and mysterious in a very Cosmere way, and despite knowing very little about them so far, I can tell that they're going to be one of my favorite Cosmere species overall. So this species has 4 arms, they're bone white, and they, for some reason, are apparently very good guides in the cognitive realm. I don't really know why. They also appear to fill a similar sort of ecological niche as humans, but for the Fane ecology on Yolin. And to explain really quickly what that is, Fane life is a form of ecology on Yolin that appears to be sort of like waging ecological war with non-Fane life. And yeah, we don't know much about this either, but apparently dragons also originate from the Fane side of things, if you wanted to be even more confused by all this. Beyond what I've mentioned already, there's not really a whole lot we know about the Shodel or their culture, and we've really only seen them show up in the Cosmere twice so far. Both like very brief like mentions. But we know that there are planets out there inhabited by mostly Shodel, and we know that they're going to be showing up in Dragonsteel. I really can't wait to see more of them, and hopefully we're properly introduced to them sooner rather than later. In the meantime, let's go ahead and drop by Scadrial and see what sort of weirdness they got cooking up sentient life-wise over there. Oh wow, this looks pretty normal. Maybe just another race of humans or something, I hear you wonder. No, you fool! As you can see by the translucent skin and weird-ass bones, these things are clearly not that. No, this is a Khandra. This is a shape-shifting being designed to blend in to normal human populations by taking on, well, basically whatever appearance they want. At the beginning of Mistborn Era 1, they are quite mysterious creatures that use human bones to help mold themselves into the human form of their choosing. They have mixed results actually passing as humans, but several of them have been acting at humanity for quite some time now. And beyond that, there's not really a whole lot I can say without getting into spoilers, so let's go ahead and move forward and do just that. And I do have to preface this by saying that though we are moving into the spoiler territory, I'm still going to be leaving out some of the very important plot points themselves. I'm doing this so I can say in good conscience that I don't think any information beyond this point in the video is actually going to ruin your enjoyment of the Cosmere if you're reading for the first time. It'll just take a little bit of the surprise away. For instance, when I talk about Harmony, I'm not going to be talking about who or what Harmony actually is, where it falls in the timeline, that sort of thing. I'll leave that for you to read about. All this video is concerned about is the actual fantasy creatures and their relationship to each other, not really how they factor into the actual plot of these stories. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into this. Sweet. Since we were just talking about Kandra, let's go ahead and continue right from there. As some of you may have guessed, Kandra sort of resemble mist wraiths in some ways, and that is an entirely accurate connection to be making. Go you, gold star. So Kandra are simply mist wraiths that have been given the blessing of sentience via 2 metal spikes. These blessing spikes are indeed hemalurgic and hold an inherent power within them that gives each Kandra an additional ability, with 4 abilities being known so far. The history behind both mist wraiths and Kandra is incredibly weird and super interesting, and yeah, I'm leaving out some important context here that you'll have to read in the books yourself. But the story goes basically as follows. Once upon a time, the Lord Ruler came rolling into town and used his massive brain and arcane magical powers to institute a number of changes to a number of other powerful magical individuals. But he didn't just unalive them. He straight up turned them into mist wraiths, cursed to walk the land, disconnected from their very minds. Because a mist wraith is basically just that. It's a magical body that has had its consciousness disconnected from its cognitive aspect. Spikes are what give mist wraiths their mind back. It connects their physical body to the cognitive realm in a way. The Lord Ruler, in his infinite wisdom, chose to select a few individuals to bless with said spikes, which in turn became the first generation of Kandra to walk around on Scadrial. Every so often, new spikes are given to new mist wraiths, which in turn form new generations of Kandra. Things stayed pretty static with the Kandra for more or less like 1,000 years, whereupon Harmony became a thing and took into its care the race of Kandra. Nowadays, they're basically like his secret helpers and are known as the Faceless Immortals by the population of Scadrial. Well, for a time, they were, at least. At some point in the Cosmere timeline, this Harmony fellow straight up, freed them. He unshackled them, turning them loose to roam the Cosmere and do, pretty much whatever. What's that? You wanted context? Too bad, because I really don't have any to give you, spoilerful or not. We don't know what the hell happened there. The important takeaway there is that they have been unshackled from Harmony, and we don't know quite when or why this happened. Now, speaking of unshackling, let's go ahead and talk about the Colossus. I had no idea how to speak about their sentience in detail without stepping right into some of the plot points from Era 1 about their birth process, so I just decided to throw most of their info into this section. So there's 2 different types of Colossus we're going to be talking about today. There's the Era 1 and the Era 2 variants. Era 1 Colossus are, well, they're brutal. Everything about them is more or less violent, from their creation to their lives, up to and including their deaths. Making a Colossus is relatively straightforward, if rather gruesome. So you gotta gather up 5 people, magically stab 4 of them to create hemalurgic spikes, yeet all those spikes into the 1 remaining human, and then the spiritual aspects of the 4 dead humans are somehow grafted onto the spirit web of the other, and voila, a Colossus is born. Originally created and employed by the Lord Ruler, these monstrosities start out strong as hell and then just never stop growing. Their muscles enlarge and stretch out their now blue skin, ripping it apart until you can literally see the muscles underneath. And eventually they get so large that their hearts simply just give out and they just kind of drop dead. Colossus can't really reproduce the normal way. So to make more Koloss, you have to either waste the lives of 5 more humans or steal the spikes out of the dead Koloss. Like I said, brutal, violent lives. And since they were human after all, they are more or less sentient throughout this entire process. And so we can all breathe a collective sigh of relief that Era 2's Koloss are much, much better off. When Harmony did Harmony things, he switched up the way that Koloss functions somewhat. They're still living on the outskirts of society, but they're now living in a tribal community where they're able to exist more or less peacefully. They're also able to actually reproduce now, with their offspring being named Koloss-blooded. Koloss-blooded have slightly blue skin, and they're slightly stronger than their average human, but they can indeed pass as more or less fully human. At the age of around 12, they're able to make the decision as to whether or not they actually want to make the full transition into a full Koloss or live as a human. If they choose not to, which, thank Harmony is an option now, they're able to leave their villages and make their way into the cities. The main drawback there being that they often face a fair bit of discrimination in the cities, being unfairly labeled by city dwellers as, kind of dumb. If they do choose to transition to full Koloss, they are spiked in a ritual ceremony and undergo the same transition as their forebears. And I can't really find a source on this, but I'm pretty sure we can assume that Harmony had something to do with the providing of the requisite spikes for those ceremonies. That seems like something that Harmony would want to take care of. Koloss are a lot, man. Let's go ahead and move over to Roshar again, shall we? Now that we're back in Roshar and we're in spoiler territory, there is something that I've been not entirely upfront about. Actually, there's a lot of things on Roshar that I haven't been entirely upfront about, but let's start with the singers and their relationship with the Spren. As you may have been able to piece together by this point, the Parshendi are in a sense no different from other life forms on Roshar. They too have gem hearts, and they too are able to use the planet's Spren to their advantage. During a high storm, a singer is able to form a bond with a lesser Spren, who then inhabits their gem heart and spurs a sort of change in the singer's form. Or it's not even a sort of change, it's like they literally change forms. And not just how the singers look is affected, the way they act, the way they think, and yeah, their physical appearance is liable to change depending on what form they choose. Some various forms we've witnessed in the books include warg form, mate form, war form, nimble form. Each form has a purpose, and each form a different corresponding Spren. In fact, bonding with Spren seems to be a more or less integral part of the life cycle of all native Rosharan fauna. Such creatures as the sky eels, I told you that was coming back. They form bonds with Spren that apparently allow them to reduce their weight or enable, flying through the sky easier. Strangely, it's actually music Spren that appear most often around Rhyshadium, and I can't wait to find out exactly why. Honestly, I really hope that we get to explore the Rhyshadium a bit more in general, because I've given you pretty much all the information we have on them, and there's definitely more going on there. Great shells in particular seem to be intimately linked to various Spren, and their life cycle seems to take advantage of various Spren as they grow, pupate, and mature. The massive great shells known as chasm fiends, we talked about them earlier if you'll recall, are able to form a bond with a variety of Spren named Mandra. Now, these Spren are connected to the surge of gravity in some way, and when they're inside of a Chasm Fiend's gem heart, they're able to make the Chasm Fiend somewhat less heavy, manipulating gravity in some way, shape, or form. In fact, without these Spren inside of their gem hearts providing gravitational assistance, Chasm Fiends literally couldn't walk. They are that massive. And I mean, they're gonna need to walk if the singers are gonna ride them, right? Yes. Apparently the singers ride these things. How they're able to communicate or work together is completely unknown, but one thing is very clear. The singers sing the rhythms of Roshar. They're sorts of songs that can be attuned to express emotion, to draw Spren, a myriad of other things. These rhythms are everywhere on Roshar. Like I mentioned earlier, the singers they're intimately connected to the land, as are the high storms, the spren, great shells, chitin-based life forms all around. They all form this cohesive ecology that all works in harmony. And when Roshar was functioning properly, they were able to live together in a sort of balance. And that is where I'm going to have to leave you today, folks. I'll see you very soon for every single example of living magic throughout the Cosmere. I've been Lore of the Worlds, and this is the second time I've had to record this stupid script. Thank you folks for tuning in today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking about the Cosmere with you. If you enjoy what I do over on this channel, I would strongly urge you to consider supporting me over on Patreon. Not only does it directly support the channel, you also get early access to content, channel updates, previews, and much, much more. I'll see you folks very soon, and I hope you have a lovely day.